tonight we're having a look at a pair of SU carburetors, a pair that are actually the Hitachi version of the British SU carburettor, as used on many Japanese cars throughout the 60s, 70s and several cars well into the 80s. These have been attached to a good old-fashioned $50 second-hand Datsun L series engine in a Datsun 510 or 1600 as it's known here in Australia, and the thing was started up for the first time a few days ago, and all was running well for the first 5 or 6 starts until the thing started spluttering and running rich and coughing and spilling fuel out of this overflow hose here that runs off the float chamber on each of the 2 carburetors. The back one was okay, it didn't seem to be spilling any fuel out, but the front one would pour fuel out every time I started the motor. And these guys normally connect up to the air cleaner assembly, but with the assembly off, that fuel ends up pretty much straight on the exhaust system, which is obviously not the ideal situation. So on a bit of advice from Dave on the datnet.org forum, I had a bit of a look inside and tried to work out what was going wrong. Now my first suspicion was here inside the float chamber, which holds the fuel for the carburettor. I suspected the needle and seat assembly might have been a bit faulty, or maybe a bit of dirt or grit or something stuck in there, not allowing it to seat and shut the fuel flow off when required. But on closer inspection I've found something slightly more sinister. So let's have a closer look at what's inside the float chamber. If you look inside, you'll see the chamber is basically a cylinder made from aluminium, and floating up and down in there is a small sealed brass float arrangement, which obviously floats up and down based on how much petrol is inside the float chamber. The concept being that when the float is in the down position, the needle and seat will be open, or the tap will be open at the top of the assembly. Fuel will flow from the fuel hose through the seat, needle and seat, and then down into the float bowl, the float chamber. Then the float will slowly float up as the thing fills. Once the fuel gets to the prescribed height, the top of the float makes contact with this little lever, which activates the needle valve and blocks off the fuel flow, which means you've got a nice full bowl of fuel without it overflowing, which is the problem I'm having at the moment. Now you can see on the side of this float bowl is a small length of plastic tube, the sort of tubing that you might use on a fish tank, and it's a little handy tip I learnt somewhere off the internet that allows you to check the float level of the float chamber. So it's simply all I've used. I found a bit of old fuel hose and connected it into a T-piece, then ran this tube vertically up in parallel with the side of the float chamber, and from that I can actually get a gauge on what the fuel level is in the float bowl by looking at it from the outside. And I was seeing this guy going right up to the top when in fact it should be something like 23 millimeters or so below the gasket surface, whereas mine was going right up, and in some cases, as I said, flowing out of this hose onto the exhaust system. So let's have a closer look at the float assembly and see what might be causing our problem. So here we are at the back of the car with the float. As you can see, it's a little brass cylinder that normally runs up and down in the float chamber. As it gets to the top, it pushes on the lever, which pushes on the needle and seat to turn the tap off, to turn the needle and seat off. Then as the fuel bowl lowers in level, it then opens up the needle and seat, allowing more fuel to come back into the bowl. Once again, as the bowl fills up, this pushes on the seat to turn the fuel flow off again. Now that's all good and well if the float's working properly, but in the case of mine, it appears the float has worn out a little bit. You can see the side of it quite shiny where it's been rubbing on the sides of the float chamber over the years. And what we've got at the moment, this guy's actually got a bit of a split in it somewhere, and it's actually began to fill with fuel. Have a listen to this. What that means is this guy stays partially submerged in the float bowl, doesn't it? So it's not able to actually float all the way up and shut the fuel flow off. So this float is actually the reason for my overfueling and spilling fuel. It's probably not the needle and seat, but the float itself. So I'll either need to get this guy fixed or find a replacement, I guess. Thanks to Dave from the datnet.org forum for pointing this one out. I wouldn't have worked it out for myself. So hopefully I'll be able to report back with a car that runs well once I fix this little problem.